Hello, good morning, everyone. Just checking you can all hear me. I think the microphone is working. Thanks, Matt, for the very kind introduction. I'm Mike Hemsley. I'm Deputy Director at the Energy Transitions Commission, and I'll explain in a minute what that is. But it is a pleasure to be here this morning talking to some of the UK's leaders in sustainability. Hopefully, I'm fairly well placed to do that. Prior to joining the Energy Transitions Commission, I worked for the UK Committee on Climate Change for 8 years, looking at UK carbon budgets and how we might reduce emissions in the UK. And then, rather naively, possibly, I thought UK decarbonisation was getting too easy, so I decided to move to a global think tank called the Energy Transitions Commission to think about global decarbonisation issues. And that's what I want to talk to you, or the point of view I want to come to you with today. So first of all, let me introduce the ETC, what our vision is, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what net zero might mean for energy security, and then what are the implications for policy, particularly in the near term on that as well. So the Energy Transitions Commission is a global member coalition. We are basically a think tank, but I think that makes us not just any think tank, because we have about 60 members globally, mostly from the energy, industry, and finance spaces, who support and back our analysis. And we skew towards European members, big energy players like Ørsted, Iberdrola, things like that. We do have BP and Shell on the oil and gas side, but we also have LONGi in China and Envision in China and Japan and Aquapower in the Middle East. So we really try and maintain that global perspective there. And what we do is we produce analysis which we hope can be used to accelerate the pace of global decarbonisation. We've done that for about 7 years. I think the initial piece that we did was on how to decarbonize everything, basically, in a piece called Mission Possible back in 2018. And I remember when I was at the Committee on Climate Change, that was really instrumental in helping us argue that the UK's net zero target should be moved from 80% towards actually 100% full net zero, because the ETC did this piece of work which said you can decarbonize everything using known technologies, and it's not actually that costly. Since then, the ETC has been on a journey to understand, well, what is the clean energy system vision for the world by mid-century? And how do you actually achieve that vision? And broadly, that vision is electricity is the core component of all energy by mid-century. Today, it's just 20% of all final energy demand. But by mid-century, we think that would need to be around 60% overall. And the main reason that is because the great success story of the energy transition so far is making renewables and batteries really, really cheap. So over the last decade, solar has come down 90% in costs, wind and batteries 80%. And all of that means that we know we can use that to plug into existing electricity systems, also scale that to things like electric vehicles, heat pumps, use clean electricity for those sources, but also create things like green hydrogen from this really cheap electricity and use that, say, in aviation fuel or in direct reduced iron in steel production, for example. So that's about 60% of the vision. Hydrogen maybe another 15%, and that remaining 25% or so would be things like sustainable bioenergy and some very limited use of fossil fuels, which continues alongside carbon capture and storage. But we're talking about 5 to 15% of today's current energy levels still coming from fossil fuels in 2050. So really, really a dramatic reduction there in order to make this vision achievable across the world. So that's the long-term piece. We do also look at the short-term piece as well, and you try and say, is the energy transition happening? And actually, when we look across the big emitters in the world, the EU, China, the US, to some extent India, we do think that the energy transition is happening. 2 in 5 vehicles this year sold in China will be electric, not fossil fuel, and that's accelerating. It's about 1 in 5 in Europe at the moment. It's slightly less in the US. Renewables are also booming. This year, possibly next year, we'll see renewables shift coal down in the Chinese power system, and that's something, as in the climate community, we're really watching out for, because that will be the key stepping stone on the journey to peak emissions in China and massive progress for global decarbonisation. The EU has got good build-out rates of things like renewables, EVs, heat pumps. It's got ambitious targets. And we're really heartened by the Inflation Reduction Act in the US last year, which has also brought the US more in line with the EU on those type of targets as well. So incentives for renewables, hydrogen, carbon capture, electric vehicles, things like that. So across 3 of the 4 biggest emitters, India aside, things really are booming. India is starting to catch up as well. They're talking about carbon pricing, carbon border adjustment by 2025. So we also look then, well, what is likely to derail the transition overall? And we've got a whole body of work which says, like, well, what are the barriers that we might expect and how might you look to overcome them? And again, we think all of these are surmountable. So in terms of overall build rates, can you scale supply chains to build this stuff at enough pace? We think you can. So the global solar supply chain produces around 300 gigawatts of solar power every year. About half of that's actually installed in China, and a good part of that is exported to the rest of the world. That supply chain is actually already planning to triple that capacity by 2030, because that's their market expectation. Solar will triple by 2030, so that's already kind of baked in. It's not quite the same for wind, but it's a very similar story for batteries. So again, supply chains largely manageable. Finance, no fundamental issues. I think there's been very good case studies in countries like the UK where if you get good policy design right, the money flows in. Contracts for Difference for renewables has been the key success story. I think we expect the same thing with things like electric vehicle targets. That's been done successfully in the UK, but many other countries around the world as well. We think finance needs to triple to 2030 globally, from 1 trillion a year to 3.5 trillion, but we think that's completely manageable. The real risk is, can you get finance at low cost into emerging markets? And that's where we see the real gap there. Grids is another one. I think we're kicking ourselves a little bit, because if we'd done all the right kind of bureaucracy and regulation around grids, we wouldn't have a problem scaling them. But we should have done all that 5 years ago. Now we are actually catching up a bit, but it does risk being a bit of a barrier in markets like the EU. And planning and permitting is another one as well. In some cases, planning documents can be 10,000 pages long. You might need 8 different permits. There's a lot of common sense ideas out there, or examples of where in Denmark, for example, instead of having 8 permitting bodies for an offshore wind farm, they just have 1. So if you can streamline all of those things, all of this stuff is fundamentally possible. So that's the overall vision. Let me then talk about net zero and energy security a bit more specifically. So in principle, we think that net zero does bring more energy security. First of all, net zero means wind and solar, and unlike fossil fuel reserves and resources, wind and solar are pretty evenly distributed around the world. There's the odd country which actually doesn't have much wind and may be quite crowded, such as Bangladesh, and may not be able to install that much solar. But most countries are either sunny, windy, or both, and that broadly means a more diversity of supply, greater energy security in principle. It also reduces the imports of fossil fuels, and that's quite a big lens for a lot of people, especially national governments, looking at energy security. So, it's a little bit of a myth as well, though. I think the UK was, for a period of time, self-sufficient in its fuel production in recent memory, between 1980 and 2000. But since 2000, the UK has been a net importer of fossil fuels. And actually, I checked yesterday, and the UK imports about as much fuel as it exports overall. So, how you actually define energy security with that is a bit of a myth, I think. But overall, because we're very confident in countries like the UK, fossil fuel demand will be declining. We don't think there's an import dependency energy security risk for the UK on that, and the CCC is very strong on agreeing with that. It also reduces your spending on volatile fossil fuels as well. We've seen in the last year how volatile fossil fuel prices can be. Just to give you a sense of how big these numbers are, just for the petrol and diesel in our cars every year, the UK spends £20 billion every year. That will go to zero in 2050 with electric vehicles. And instead of paying that largely to imports of fossil fuels, that will go to domestic renewable generators who produce the wind and solar to feed into our electric vehicles there. Oh, and it will be a third of the cost, because electric vehicles are 3 times efficient as their internal combustion engine comparators. So overall, we do think there's a benefit. But a lot of people are using last year's kind of energy crisis to suggest that net zero was the cause and fossil fuels might be the fix. And that's something we've actually looked into quite a lot in the last year, and something we're publishing as part of a major report we're publishing tomorrow on the implications of the transition for fossil fuels. But if we just look at what actually happened in the energy crisis, just to remind you, so when Russia invaded Ukraine, gas prices in Europe went up about 5 times in a matter of weeks, because Russia was 40% of Europe's gas supply, and Europe had to scramble to replace all of that within a very short period of time. So gas prices went up about 5 times. They're now still about 2 times their pre-crisis levels, and Europe largely looked to replace all of that Russian gas supply with liquefied natural gas overall. But liquefied natural gas is only 10% of global gas market, so there's a massive scramble for that. Everybody in the liquefied natural gas market put up their price quite a lot, and that's the main driver of those price increases overall. So the question is asked, could increased fossil fuel investment have avoided that overall? I think it's an interesting one to look at. Well, could it? So first of all, new fossil fuel investment takes about 5 years to come to fruition. Shale gas in the US maybe being a minor exception, but if you talk about new large-scale oil and gas extraction or liquefied natural gas infrastructure, it's about a 5-year lead time. So you would have needed to be planning this for about five years in advance. So what did happen 5 years ago was actually a massive boom in natural gas exports. In 2016, the US didn't export any liquefied natural gas at all, and now it exports enough liquefied natural gas to supply 20% of Europe's gas market. So there's been a massive boom in liquefied natural gas already over the past 5 years. It begs belief a bit for me to say that we would have predicted you need even more 5 years ago, and we would have taken business cases to financiers and things like that to say, we want to add even more liquefied natural gas into this really, really growing and booming market. So the US increased liquefied natural gas. Other countries did as well. Could domestic natural gas or fossil fuels have helped? Well, potentially, but fossil fuels are sold at international market prices. So, unless you can displace absolutely everything that you import, everybody basically pays the marginal cost of those imports. So unless you displace the entirety of the 40% that you got from Russia within European produced gas, again, you're not going to have an influence on the price you pay those international markets. And I don't think anyone was talking about investing that much in new domestic supply in Europe, given that we know domestic demand in Europe is falling. I mentioned already 1 in 5 vehicles sold which use oil are now electric vehicles, and that's only going to increase. The EU and the UK now have 100% sales targets for 2035 for those vehicles. They also have 2035 targets for power sector decarbonisation, which will reduce the gas use in the power sector. And they have incentives for heat pump uptake as well, which would reduce gas use in buildings. So who in their right mind is going to be investing at scale in massive new fossil fuel infrastructure in Europe? So overall, I don't think that would have helped. What has actually helped, though, is increased clean energy technology. We're really pleased to see Europe double down on the 2030 commitments overall. Build rates for renewables actually, even in the last year, doubled what they were in the previous few years on average. So there's a massive reaction in just getting more wind turbines and more solar panels installed, and that's already, again, helping to displace fossil fuels. Heat pumps have been a good story as well. So overall, I think what is certainly true is that if you're a fossil fuel investor or a fossil fuel company and you'd invested in more fossil fuels 5 years ago, you would have made a lot more money over the last few years. But what is not necessarily true is that would have made any difference whatsoever in terms of energy security. And looking forward, given decreases in fossil fuel demand, which we're near certain of in China, the EU, and the US, it's not clear that any new fossil fuel supply is really required in order to deliver energy security in those markets when clean energy is booming. That said, there are some legitimate concerns around net zero and energy security, and I do want to focus on those. I don't want to gloss over them, even if we don't think they were the cause of the recent energy crisis. So first of all, supply chains is actually important. So even though that wind and solar, wind and the sun are relatively evenly dispersed around the world, the actual material inputs for the technologies in order to use that power it generates are not. And actually, the concentration of some of those critical material inputs can be relatively diversified, such as lithium, a key component in batteries, which can be found in Canada, Europe, South America, Australia, for example. Some of those critical materials are actually really dominated by certain supply chains. 50% of all the nickel we need for batteries is produced in Indonesia. China controls 50% of the graphite we need for batteries, and 70% of the rare earth materials, which are typically used in wind turbines as well. So there are really some kind of raw extraction challenges for supply chains. And then on the processing side, China is even more dominant. So China produces 80% of the world's solar panels, 60% of the world's wind turbines, and 60% of the world's batteries and electric vehicles. And that starts to, even though they've got really large domestic demand for those technologies, that starts to look like a real challenge overall. And both of those reasons are why countries are looking to domesticate their clean energy supply chains overall. And for the actual processing side of things, it doesn't really matter where you do that. That just depends on, can you do it competitively with cheap energy costs and cheap labor costs? And if you can do that in the UK, great. But for the actual raw material extraction, that's a wider geopolitical challenge. And that's why you're seeing the EU and the US create these kind of buyers clubs to go to countries and say, we don't want you to just sell all of your output to China. Can you sell some to us instead? So that is a real material challenge. But one that kind of needs to be tackled at the highest level in order to really get right. I think the business focus could be more on the more downstream supply chains there. So that's one of the reasons, supply chains overall. Secondly, the nature of the system will change. You know, we're talking about a system which is much more electric. That's much more reliant on a single fuel rather than multiple different fuels. So instead of electricity just powering your house, it might replace your gas supply as well and power your heat pump. And it will replace your oil supply and power your car as well. You know, over-reliance on one thing means if that's disrupted, you're more affected. So you will need to protect those systems, build extra capacity in those systems even more, especially because we know that those systems will be dominated by wind and solar supply. And there will be times that you just have to plan for where the wind won't blow and the sun won't shine. And the ultimate answer for that is, you know, we probably need some extra system storage that we as consumers need to pay for to make sure that we do have that energy security there. So I don't think that's a surprise. It's just the changing nature of the system, and that kind of stuff needs to be planned for overall. And then worth just noting that, of course, not tackling climate change is not necessarily good for security in general, whether you consider that energy security or not. But the impacts of climate change are likely to be highly disruptive. So it's not really a meaningful counterfactual to say that we don't do any of this stuff anyway. So where does that leave us today, and you know, what does that mean for kind of consumers? The standard of living and how we take this stuff forward? Well, we think that all the fundamentals remain true. So renewables are cheaper than new build fossil fuel generation in the power sector in over 2/3 of global electricity generating markets. They're actually cheaper than running existing fossil fuels in over half of those already. So fundamentally, renewables means cheaper electricity. Similarly, electric vehicles over this decade will mean cheaper driving for drivers as well. We're seeing the cost fall in batteries, and because of the efficiency gains, driving and owning a vehicle, and if it's electric, is likely to be cheaper than its fossil fuel equivalent. There will be some costs, though, and we don't want to shy away from those. But when we calculate those, there's something like 0.5% of GDP. And where those costs actually fall is decarbonizing the hard-to-abate sectors, you know, international shipping. But if you used sustainable fuel in the ship that brings my Amazon package from China to me, I literally would not notice the increasing cost that would apply on my Amazon package. Sustainable aviation fuel, you might notice a bit more of a difference. Steel, you might notice a bit more of a difference as well. So there are some green premiums that you have to pay. But most of the policies that we need for net zero don't actually have to be costly. Even carbon prices, what we're doing with carbon prices around the world now is introducing them, but also reflecting them on our competitors. So if you produce steel using in Europe, you might have to pay a carbon price, but we'll also charge Chinese steel the same carbon price when we bring it into Europe as well. So that's not necessarily a net increase in cost or competitiveness. Things like electric vehicle targets, renewables targets can also deliver a lot of progress without any additional costs. And we see for the new long-term contracts in renewables don't actually require any net subsidy compared to the electricity price that we already pay. It's just a de-risking mechanism now. It's not an actual increase in cost. But we do have to recognize that the focus, for both bill payers and government has changed in the last few years as a result of the energy crisis. We're still facing a situation where average energy bills are roughly 2 times what they were pre-crisis levels, and that just means it's a much more front-of-mind issue overall. We also know that government budgets are very strapped, and they're reluctant to incentivize any new funding. But we're all aware that government funding is always a very small subset of the overall funding flowing into the stuff overall. But maybe the more material change is what's going on with interest rates and interest rate rises. A lot of what we need to finance here is very capital intensive, and we have seen a real increase in interest rates occur in the last year or so, and that would just mean the cost of financing all of this might increase as well. Again, that doesn't change the fundamentals. Renewables still cheaper, electric vehicles still cheaper, but it will make those figures a little bit more eye-watering when you look at how much you actually need to invest. And the big question for me is, what can policy do to actually de-risk that, maybe spread that over a longer period of time to make some of those figures a bit more manageable? So just to wrap up, what would then be the kind of policy asks I have for you in the room and more broadly? I think, first of all, we are in a bit of a situation where there's a bit of a doubt about some businesses' net zero commitments. So I think the first ask is really just double down on what you've already committed to, because we still think the fundamentals are there. We still think all of this is possible, and we think the world is moving in that direction as well. So I think it would really reinforce the message if businesses double down on those things. And then it's about translating some of those targets into action, be that sourcing renewable energy, improving energy efficiency of the processes, even some of the stuff which is really hard, like sustainable aviation fuel in your airlines, if you are an airline, or in the flights, if you are a business, those kind of things. Beyond that, we also think it's not just important to reduce your emissions, but we do think you need to scale up carbon dioxide removals as well. So I think there's really scope for kind of looking beyond your own value chain and saying, well, what's the greatest good I can contribute to this movement overall at the fastest pace? And we think that does include a role for carbon dioxide removals. I will leave it there, but thank you very much for having me.